There is a single question that every homeowner who has ever picked up a paintbrush has eventually been forced to ask themselves. Why does the paint keep peeling? You bought good paint. You may have even bought a primer. You prepared the surface as well as you knew how. You applied 2 coats the way the instructions said. You cleaned up, stepped back, and looked at walls that appeared perfectly painted. And then 6 months later, or a year later, or 2 years later, the edges started lifting. The corners started curling. Long strips of paint began separating from the wall surface and hanging there like the skin of something that had been sunburned one too many times. And you painted over it, and it peeled again. And you painted over it again, and it peeled again. And every time you called a painter or walked into a paint store, you were told the same things, that you needed a better primer, that you needed a more expensive paint, that you needed professional preparation, that peeling was just something that happened, and that repainting every few years was simply the cost of home ownership. Every single one of those answers was designed to sell you something. None of them addressed the actual reason paint peels, and none of them told you about the one preparation step that prevents paint from ever peeling again, a step that professional old-world trade painters used as standard practice for over 100 years, that cost less than $1, and that the modern paint and primer industry has spent decades making sure you never hear about. The solution is raw linseed oil, a naturally occurring plant-derived oil pressed from flax seeds that has been used as a surface conditioner, wood preservative, and paint bonding agent by craftsmen, builders, and painters across 5 centuries of documented history. You brush it onto your wall surface before painting. It penetrates deeply into the porous substrate, polymerizes inside the pores as it cures, and creates a sealed, flexible molecular foundation that paint bonds to permanently. Paint applied over a linseed oil-treated surface does not peel. Not in 6 months, not in 2 years, not in 20 years. Because the fundamental reason paint peels, a porous, unstable substrate that cannot maintain a permanent bond with the paint film above it, has been permanently eliminated before the first drop of paint ever touched the wall. This knowledge has been sitting in old-world painting trade manuals, in historical building preservation guides, and in the working knowledge of professional restoration painters for over 100 years. It costs less than $1 per treatment, and the $8 billion paint primer industry has spent decades burying it under an avalanche of branded primer products that address the surface of the problem without ever solving it permanently. Welcome to the ancient prepper. If recovering practical forgotten knowledge that the modern world buried under billions of dollars of branded products is what brought you here, subscribe right now and ring that notification bell, because this channel exists for exactly one reason: to give back what was taken from you. To understand why linseed oil solves the paint peeling problem permanently, where primer and expensive paint consistently fail to deliver a lasting result, you need to understand what is actually happening at the molecular level when paint peels, and why the standard preparation approach that the paint industry recommends never addresses the real cause of the problem. Paint peeling is not a paint quality problem. It is not a primer quality problem. It is not a problem that more coats or more expensive products solve. Paint peeling is a substrate problem, a problem with the surface the paint is applied to rather than with the paint itself. And until the substrate problem is addressed at its root cause, no paint product applied on top of it will ever bond permanently, regardless of its quality or price. Here is what is actually happening. Every wall surface, whether it is drywall, plaster, wood, masonry, or previously painted surface, is a porous material. The surface is permeated with microscopic pores, capillaries, and voids that form a network of tiny channels throughout the substrate material. When the substrate is exposed to moisture from humidity in the air, from water vapor moving through the wall from outside, from the normal moisture content changes that any building material undergoes with seasonal temperature and humidity variation, water molecules move in and out of these microscopic pores. As moisture enters the substrate, the material expands microscopically. As moisture leaves the substrate, the material contracts. This constant microscopic movement, expansion with moisture gain, contraction with moisture loss, happens continuously throughout the life of any painted wall surface. Paint is a relatively inflexible film sitting on top of this constantly moving substrate. When the substrate expands and contracts with moisture cycling, the paint film is subjected to stress as the surface beneath it moves, while the paint above tries to maintain its shape. Over time, this repeated stress cycling, the substrate expanding and contracting while the paint film resists, fatigues the bond between the paint and the substrate. The bond fails progressively, first at the edges and corners where stress concentrations are highest, then across larger areas as the bond fatigue spreads. The paint lifts, curls, and peels away from the surface in the pattern that every homeowner recognizes from bitter experience. Standard primer products address this problem partially, but not completely. Primer creates a more uniform and slightly more porous surface for the paint to bond to. It seals some of the larger surface pores and provides a more consistent foundation than bare substrate. But primer does not penetrate deeply into the substrate and seal the moisture movement pathways at the source. It sits on the surface as a thin coating that improves the bonding situation at the very top of the substrate, but leaves the deeper moisture cycling dynamics completely unaddressed. Which is why primed and painted surfaces still peel, more slowly than unprimed surfaces perhaps, but they still peel because the fundamental cause has not been eliminated. Raw linseed oil eliminates the fundamental cause. This is the distinction that makes it so extraordinarily effective and so inconvenient for the primer industry to acknowledge. Raw linseed oil is pressed from the seeds of the flax plant, Linum usitatissimum, one of the oldest cultivated plants in human history. Flax has been cultivated for fiber, food, and oil for at least 10,000 years. The oil pressed from flax seeds contains a remarkably high concentration of polyunsaturated fatty acids, primarily alpha-linolenic acid, that give raw linseed oil a unique property that distinguishes it from almost every other natural oil. When raw linseed oil contacts oxygen, it does not simply dry the way water evaporates. It undergoes a chemical polymerization reaction. The individual oil molecules link together into long polymer chains, cross-linking with each other and with the substrate surface molecules to form a hard, flexible, completely waterproof film that is chemically bonded to the substrate at the molecular level. This polymerization process, called oxidative curing, is what makes linseed oil so extraordinarily effective as a surface conditioner and paint foundation. When you apply raw linseed oil to a porous wall surface, it immediately begins wicking into the microscopic pores and capillaries of the substrate through capillary action, penetrating deeply into the material rather than sitting on the surface the way primer does. As it penetrates, the curing process begins. The oil polymerizes inside the pores, filling them with a flexible waterproof polymer that seals the moisture movement pathways from the inside. The substrate is now sealed at the molecular level. Moisture can no longer move freely in and out of the pores because the oil polymer has filled them. The microscopic expansion and contraction cycle that fatigues paint bonds over time is dramatically reduced because the moisture penetration that drives that cycle has been prevented at the source. Additionally, the cured linseed oil polymer creates an extraordinarily strong chemical bonding surface for the paint applied above it. The paint does not just sit on top of a surface and rely on mechanical adhesion to stay there. It bonds chemically to the linseed oil polymer layer that has penetrated into and become part of the substrate itself. The result is a paint bond that is not a surface adhesion, it is a molecular integration. The paint, the linseed oil layer, and the substrate are effectively one unified material rather than three separate layers stacked on top of each other. And a unified material does not peel. Now, let me take you through the history of this material, because the story of how linseed oil became the foundational preparation compound for 5 centuries of professional painting and building craft, and how that knowledge was systematically replaced by branded primer products in the mid-20th century, is one of the most clear and well-documented cases of ancient practical knowledge being buried by commercial interest in the entire history of the building trades. The use of linseed oil as a paint medium and surface conditioner by European painters is documented continuously from the 15th century onward. The Flemish painters of the early Renaissance, Jan van Eyck and his contemporaries, are credited with developing and perfecting oil painting techniques using linseed oil as both a paint medium and a panel preparation compound in the early 1400s. Leonardo da Vinci used linseed oil extensively in his painting preparation and technique. Rembrandt van Rijn used linseed oil treatments as foundational preparation for every surface he painted on. These were not decorative painters working on canvas in studios. Many of the same oil and resin preparation techniques used by Renaissance painters on art panels were applied by trade painters and craftsmen to architectural surfaces, furniture, and building elements throughout the same period. By the 17th and 18th centuries, the use of linseed oil as a surface preparation and wood preservation compound was standard practice across the European building trades. Linseed oil treatment of exterior timber was standard maintenance practice for wooden buildings across England, Scandinavia, Germany, and the Netherlands, the regions where timber frame construction was most common and where the preservation of wooden building elements against moisture was most critical. The oil penetrated the wood fibers, sealed them against moisture penetration, and provided a flexible substrate that paint and lime wash adhered to permanently without peeling. When European building and painting traditions crossed the Atlantic with colonial settlers, the linseed oil preparation knowledge came with them. Colonial American builders and painters used linseed oil as standard preparation for exterior wood surfaces on the timber frame homes they constructed across New England, the Mid-Atlantic, and the southern colonies. The great historic homes of the 18th and 19th centuries that still stand today and that still have their original paint in many cases were built and maintained using linseed oil preparation methods that kept paint adhered permanently for decades between repainting cycles. Through the late 19th and early 20th centuries, as American home construction expanded massively with industrialization and urbanization, the Old World linseed oil preparation knowledge remained standard practice among trade painters who had learned their craft through traditional apprenticeship systems that transmitted the accumulated practical knowledge of generations. The house painter who came to paint your great-grandfather's home in 1920 knew to brush raw linseed oil onto bare wood and plaster surfaces before applying paint, because that was what every painter had been taught to do for as long as the trade had existed. It was not a secret technique. It was simply the correct way to prepare a surface for paint, and every tradesman who had learned properly knew it. Then, in the 1950s and 1960s, the modern paint industry underwent a transformation driven by the post-war petrochemical revolution. Synthetic latex paints replaced traditional oil-based paints as the primary residential painting product. Synthetic primer products developed from petrochemical compounds were marketed as the modern scientific replacement for traditional oil preparation methods, easier to use, faster drying, and backed by the authority of modern chemical industry research. The apprenticeship system through which old-world painting knowledge had been transmitted for generations was progressively replaced by a model where painters learned to use manufacturer-specified products according to manufacturer instructions rather than drawing on a deep understanding of why surface preparation worked at a material level. The knowledge of raw linseed oil as a primer and surface conditioner did not disappear entirely. It survived in historic preservation communities, in the restoration of old buildings, and among old-world trained craftsmen who had learned before the synthetic primer era. But it became invisible to the mainstream homeowner who was now being told by paint manufacturers, hardware stores, and painting contractors that the correct preparation for any surface was a specific branded primer product that cost $15 to $30 per gallon and that needed to be repurchased for every painting project. Meanwhile, the evidence of what linseed oil preparation actually accomplished was sitting in plain sight on every pre-1950 building that had been originally prepared with oil treatment methods, historic buildings maintained with traditional linseed oil preparation that still had paint adhering properly after 50, 60, 70 years, while modern latex painted surfaces needed repainting every 5 to 7 years. The building preservation community recognized this pattern explicitly and documented it in historic preservation literature. The mainstream painting industry preferred not to discuss it. Raw linseed oil cost between $2 and $5 per quart at any hardware store, sometimes in the paint section, sometimes in the wood finishing section. 1 quart treats a significant area of wall surface, given that the application is a thin penetrating coat rather than a surface build coat. The cost per room of wall treatment is typically under $1. Total. Here is exactly how you use it correctly. Before beginning any painting project, whether you are painting bare new drywall, previously painted walls that have been stripped or sanded, exterior wood surfaces, plaster walls, or masonry surfaces, apply a thin, even coat of raw linseed oil to the entire surface using a natural bristle brush or a paint roller. Work the oil into the surface firmly to encourage penetration into the pores rather than allowing it to pool on the surface. Apply the thinnest coat possible that still covers the entire surface evenly. Raw linseed oil is a penetrating treatment, not a surface coating, and more is not better. A thin penetrating application is significantly more effective than a thick surface application that cannot fully absorb. Allow the linseed oil to penetrate and begin curing before applying paint. In warm, dry conditions with good air circulation, this typically takes between 24 and 48 hours. The surface should feel dry to the touch and not tacky before you begin painting. In cooler or more humid conditions, the curing time extends. Never paint over linseed oil that is still tacky, as this will interfere with the paint adhesion rather than improving it. Once the linseed oil has cured to a dry surface, apply your paint using standard technique. The paint will adhere to the cured linseed oil surface with a bond strength that no standard primer product can match. And it will maintain that bond permanently because the substrate moisture cycling that breaks paint bonds over time has been eliminated at the source. For exterior wood surfaces that are particularly exposed to moisture and weathering, you can add a small amount of Japan Dryer, a metallic drying agent available at any paint store for a few dollars, to the raw linseed oil before application to accelerate the curing time from 48 hours to 12 to 18 hours without affecting the penetration and bonding properties of the oil. One honest note about application: raw linseed oil soaked applicators, brushes, rags, rollers, can self-heat through the exothermic curing reaction, and in rare cases have caused fires if left bunched up in an enclosed space. Always spread used linseed oil applicators flat to dry in a well-ventilated area, or submerge them in water until they can be properly disposed of. This is a genuine safety consideration that must be followed without exception. Your grandfather's home did not have peeling paint every 5 years. Not because the paint was better, not because the primers were more advanced. Because the man who painted it understood that paint is only as permanent as the surface preparation underneath it, and that raw linseed oil applied to the substrate before painting created a foundation that paint would never separate from. That knowledge was standard practice in the painting trade for over 100 years. It cost less than $1 per room, and it permanently solved the single most frustrating and expensive recurring home maintenance problem that any homeowner faces. The paint industry replaced it with a $30 can of synthetic primer that keeps you coming back to repaint every 5 years. Now you know what they replaced it with and why. Subscribe to this channel, share this video with every homeowner you know who has been repainting, peeling walls on a recurring cycle that never ends, and stay with me because what is coming in the next video goes even deeper into what they buried.